I definitely encountered it a lot. I encountered a lot because I live in the Northwest. It's a very familiar territory in the Northwest of the United States, and one of the ways that I think it's, I mean, obviously addressing it in a way that isn't attacking people's health, but like what I think is important to remember is that I don't think that people are necessarily wedded to this identity politics framework. I think it's the only game in town, and it was the first thing they encountered, and so they get really enmeshed in it without ever having challenged or thought about it. And so I think one of the things that's useful for me when I first start having those conversations, a lot of times it comes up as far as like identity politics as a framework, it comes up with me with like radical queer organizing, and I end up challenging it around the notion of like the policing of boundaries and how the way that identity politics, whether it means to or not, and or even sometimes just on accident, argues for a hierarchy, which is the exact opposite of what I want, and like how just sort of like the end result of identity politics oftentimes is what I call the, like lots of people call the oppression Olympics, where we become sidetracked by this need to like figure out a hierarchy of like, okay, what's like, who has it the worst and all that kind of stuff, and we become really distracted from like a proactive, like liberatory approach. Like, how are we going to organize over a patriarchy? It becomes internally as like, you know, who's the most queer and therefore the most oppressed by patriarchy, and that definitely, I don't personally find that compatible with anarchism, and I'm also an anarchist communist in my approach to like, a positive conception of liberty and organizing and that kind of stuff for me is built around that sort of proactive approach to things. And so that's usually when I argue for intersectionality, which sometimes people have not been made familiar with the philosophy and theory and ideas of it. And so I sort of present it as a counterpoint to a traditional identity politics framework and as something that is more compatible with anarchism.
I agree with everything Rome said. I mean, for me, one of the best things to do is to shift the discourse. I mean, you talk about the advantages of whiteness, the advantages of maleness, or whatever. I think that's a completely acceptable conversation, and sometimes a really productive conversation to have. But it's also important to recognize that people who are oppressed by various systems of oppression organized around identities like race and gender and so on, they're not a bunch of noble savages who suddenly have all the right answers about everything. You gotta be willing to argue with people, and if they're fucked up, tell them they're fucked up, regardless of the kinds of identities that they inhabit. Now, likewise, it also means that you have to take a self-reflective approach with that, and at least try and balance in your head the ways that you might be advantaged socially as a result of racial or other characteristics and so on. It's definitely not something that is always easy to do. Sometimes it's really difficult. And frankly, sometimes it can be a real mindfuck. But sometimes these conversations, honestly, in the United States, I've seen them start to look like Maoist self-criticism circles where everyone sits around and points at someone and they have to talk about all the ways they're privileged, you know, and shit. Like, we really kind of need to shift the discourse from stuff like that and work on it in a proactive way. People need to be called on their shit, you know, but if it needs to be done in a way that doesn't, you know, that isn't reducible to those kinds of almost cultish and weird, like, self-helpy, you know, ways of dealing with those things. That seems to me to oftentimes be anathema to struggle, not something that actually helps us organize against and attack the institutions that oppress us.
Especially when it's presented as a binary, like you either are going to completely gloss over this, or we're going to become completely immobilized by it. And I think that that's like one of the things that's important is like we need to be working, finding, and I struggle with this definitely a lot, and I find it's easier for me to struggle with it when I'm involved in organizing that's long term with real relationships with people that I'm really committed with. In those situations where we all, like, people have, like, relative levels of advantage over each other or not in all these different kinds of ways, like, all the messy ways that human relations are, like, in organizing. I think the important thing is, like, to find the balance between recognizing, like, your experiences and the advantage of understanding and listening to the experiences of others who have different, like, who have gone through the world differently than you and do have some better understanding of racism and sexism based on, like, people's experience with that haven't had that. But also at the same time, with that, recognizing that, women aren't magic and we don't all have, hello, Sarah Palin, like, just because people are women or queer or people of color doesn't mean they magically have the most amazing politics on the planet, and that we should just do whatever the most oppressed person says. And also, at the same time, that I think it reinforces a lot of, like, racism and sexism and homophobia to not challenge people when they're wrong based on their identity. But then still you also have to factor in the way that the systems of power interplay between our relationships, and like how a white man yelling at like a woman of color about her horrible politics, even if they're horrible, is still going to reflect and have racism and sexism playing a part in that interaction. It's unavoidable. You can't separate it out. It's about trying to find a way to navigate those relationships in the most honest and accountable way possible. And to me, accountability is not about never fucking up. It's impossible. We're all going to fuck up. Accountability is about sticking around after you fuck up, owning it, and working through it. And I think that's like the key point. I mean, it is messy. It's hard. It's really hard to have those conversations with people.
Solidarity Alliance local that worked around, it was a very short-lived campaign we were doing around reproductive freedom, where we were trying to reach out to folks. And basically what we did is we didn't really use formal academic discourse. We kind of just threw it in the bin, and we started instead talking about how different communities had different needs, So, of course, all the middle-class white women came in and said, we need to fight for legal choice, and actually it provided the local to say things like, well, hey, great, what does legal choice do for a poor woman who can't afford an abortion, what does legal choice do for women of color, indigenous women who have a history in the United States of forced sterilizations and, actually wanting to have the resources to just have kids, and that way you can at least bring in the set about all of the kind of academic language and stuff like that. I do think intersectionality as it exists isn't that bad, and it's probably a decent way of putting it, the word as such, intersectionality. The other shit that gets attached with it, with, all the academic studies and stuff like that, you find good ways to navigate that and leave it out of your language in your approach. I'd be curious how you do it too, shoot me an email. But the way we did it was just try and focus on the different needs of different communities and our organizing.
And I think sometimes with language too, it's like, it is possible, and again, generally you have that you have like long, like in a conversation with someone or at a protest or whatever, like it's really hard to build and convey complicated, like, well, I don't even think it's complicated ideas, but like more ideas that have been more quartered in academia that I actually think are really simple. Like, all my understanding of theory and personality, I did not learn in college classes at all. Like, I don't have a degree yet. And so, but a lot of it came from having conversations. So those conversations were with people that I had such long-term relationships with that I could come back to it and build on it and understand it better. And I think this is true of anarchism too. I think we can also get better at and being able to explain. I think especially language to a degree is unavoidable. I think because we have these ideas that are new, and so we need new words for them. But I think it takes practice in a lot of ways to just keep having conversations and keep practicing trying to explain stuff, in as plain of language as possible, which is not, I don't like the term dumbing down, because I don't think that's what it is. I think it's explaining it in plain, accessible language. And then a lot of times you can end up using that shorthand of socialized language when you've had those conversations, excuse me, because you have long-term relationships with someone, you're like, hey, intersectionality, that thing we've been talking about for the last 2 months or whatever, like that kind of thing.